was never ceded, given up, sold or traded, and that we are on stolen land. So thank you, Mark, for that introduction. I'm honoured to have been asked to speak here today about an issue that concerns all of us, and yet is an issue that should never have come into existence to begin with. I came to Australia in 1991, and just 1 year before mandatory detention was introduced by the Keating government. This inhumane, racist, xenophobic policy has formed the backdrop of my Australian experience. Along with the rise of Pauline Hanson and the One Nation Party, along with the fallout of 9/11 on Muslim communities in Australia, along with Tampa, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, too many Aboriginal deaths in custody to even count, the Cronulla riots, the Northern Territory intervention, attacks on Indian international students, and calls to ban the burqa. I've run out of fingers, but this country just can't seem to run out of ways to vilify and marginalise anyone that doesn't fit into the white Australian archetype. Race and difference are central to any discussions about Australia's treatment of refugees. Politicians may cloak the issue of border control in rhetoric around national security and infrastructure, but we know that ultimately it is about fear of the other. If it wasn't, we would see Villawood and Curtin and Darwin and Christmas Island packed full of white tourists that have overstayed their visa instead of Afghan, Iraqi and Tamil refugees. Only last month, the UN Human Rights Commissioner criticised Australia for the racial discrimination embedded in its policies on Indigenous people and refugees. Racism here is institutionalised. It permeates our society. Refugees who eventually cross the physical borders of Australia and are able to then cross the barbed wire borders of detention centres must then battle the intangible but equally sinister borders of Australian nationhood that act to exclude communities of colour and people of non-Christian faiths. We see it when refugees who protest in detention centres across Australia are branded as criminal and barbaric and lawless and savage, rather than recognising that those protests are a reaction to a dehumanising policy that itself is criminal and savage and barbaric and lawless. We saw this too last year when security was touted as the overriding factor in favour of a ban on the niqab or face veil, when we know it was just another attempt to isolate Muslim communities and criminalise niqabi women. This is to remind us that our practices and our ways of life are constantly being scrutinised and policed. We see it when asylum seekers are portrayed as negligent parents who coldly and calculatingly use their children as pawns to secure entry into Australia. We witnessed it with the lies surrounding the children overboard affair in 2001, and we witness it now with the Malaysian solution. And the supposed concern for child welfare has also been used to justify the intervention into the Northern Territory, when we know it was little more than a land grab, an attempt to roll back native title and a means to control Indigenous communities. Racism and xenophobia is endemic in Australian society. It is endemic, and if we're ever to move towards a compassionate and just refugee policy, we need to acknowledge that as a society, because Australia's treatment of refugees cannot be separated from its uneasy relationship with race more generally. So many people try to tell me that Australia doesn't have a problem with racism, that it's not that bad. Well, trust me, it is that bad. As an immigrant, as a woman of colour, as a Muslim that wears a scarf on her head, I witness and experience racism on a daily basis, and it breaks my heart. And it comes close to breaking me sometimes as well. But I work in community development, and I've been taught that as well as recognising our weaknesses, we must also celebrate our strengths, and I'm humbled and inspired by the strengths in the faces of those here today, and the strength of those whose faces remain enclosed behind razor wire fences and still continue to fight for their basic human rights. Like any other movement, the refugee rights movement here in Australia has ebbed and flowed, and I think what we are seeing now is a strong resurgence in that movement, being driven by detainees themselves, from hunger strikes to rooftop protests to breakouts. We need to continue that fight here on the outside and take it to the streets and have those discussions in our communities and build on that momentum, because we actually can do that. We have that privilege, and we're doing that right here, right now. Thank you.